It's October 1997, and Dell's chairman, Michael Saul, is sitting on stage at the Gartner IT Symposium. The interviewer references the dire state of Apple's stock market, trading below their book value, rumored to be acquired by Sun any day, and asks what he would do to fix Apple. Dell smirks, then smugly responds, "What would I do? I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders."
Years ago, Apple was synonymous with the home computer. But these days, the company is hurting, laying off workers and scaling back production.
Computer market. People are just not buying computers at the same pace of a year ago.
Financial difficulties, layoffs, buyout rumors. It's enough to make the most
on the left
loyal
is
of
taking control from Stephen Jobs on the right.
In hindsight, it was a terrible mistake for Steve to be pushed out.
Computers are given little
You've
shelf
been
space
sponsored
in
by
most
that guy
stores.
from Apple Computers?
What computers?
and others, and the reality was there was no one ever as good as Steve.
And like some are saying, don't count them out just yet.
Now 10 years later, Steve Jobs restructures the entire product pipeline and starts working on their biggest hit yet. The iMac becomes the fastest selling computer of all times. 800,000 units sold in the first 5 months. A year later, the first iBook is released, and numbers climb even higher. It's 2001. After years of development, macOS 10 revitalizes the stagnant software holding back the Apple ecosystem. But there's one more thing.
There is one more thing.
The first iPod is announced. The device goes on to dominate the market, completely reimagining the music scene, and its role, assisted by the iTunes Store, would rake in billions for the company. In a span of 3 years, Apple shares would go from $6 to $80 in value. Apple is back. On the 20th of January 2006, Apple employees are leaving their office when they receive this email.
Team, it turned out that Michael Dell wasn't perfect at predicting the future. Based on today's stock market close, Apple is worth more than Dell. Stocks go up and down and things may be different tomorrow, but I thought it was worth a moment of reflection today. Signed, Steve.
In 10 more years, Apple would become the most valuable company in the world. $1 trillion. But things could have gone differently. Much, much differently. Just like in a love story, details matter. And in this love story, the future of the world was hanging by a thread. Easily swayed by the ego of a few key players, the world as we know it was minutes away from never existing. We are Draper, and this is the biggest sliding doors in business history. In 1985, Steve Jobs was ousted by the company he founded and loved. Reports at the time claimed that Jobs was a broken man, while Apple was ready to turn a new page under the leadership of proven businessman John Sculley. Sculley turned the company upside down, extending the product line and reorganizing business into 3 main areas of products, marketing, and production, which would all report directly to him.
What we need to do is to make sure that symbolism gets translated throughout all parts of Apple. As we make this transition from single product company or a company with lots of technologies that wants to turn them into businesses.
With Sculley at the helm, Apple went from a lean, one product at a time startup approach to a horizontal strategy that tried to appeal to as many people as possible. Sculley's strategy was deceptively simple, and it sounded like, we make a boatload of different products, we market most of them to different audiences, and kind of see what happens. For a brief moment, this actually worked, and Apple regained a bit of momentum, stabilizing sales in their stock market until the early 90s. But at the same time, Sculley had shattered the foundational design core that made Apple so appealing to fans and tech enthusiasts. The real issue lay in a disjointed corporate culture, the internal conflicts between Steve and management, which ultimately led to Jobs' firings, were only the first signals of a detachment between organizational goals and personal interests.
But I believe that consistent
and more sharply defined strategies and policies, and a more experienced middle management team, and a more disciplined environment will actually help us get innovative things done quickly and effectively.
Apple, who had been known and loved for its Pyretex no fucks given brand, was now struggling to establish its identity to a wider audience. The company was divided into factions, and everything in between was caught in the line of fire, including external people and products. And with Steve out the door, so were technological innovation and world-class design. In his book, Keep It Simple, Herman Esslinger, founder of Frog Design and close collaborator with Jobs, says that the board looked at Steve and me as members of an alien species.
Oh, it was very painful. I'm not even sure I want to talk about it. What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Scully?
Yeah. And he destroyed everything I'd spent 10 years working for.
Hey guys, I'm sorry for the plug. I hate doing this, but I set up a Ko-fi page if you guys want to support us. We're both freelancers and we have full-time jobs, so it's really hard to make these videos and get them out in time. We've been doing it for quite a few years, but if you want to see some more content and support us, that would be a great way. If you have any bucks to spare, hit the link in the video description. If not, just like the video and share it and subscribe and all that good stuff. I'm sorry for the interruption. I hate doing these things, so let's get back to the video.
I think Steve Jobs' biggest mistake at the time was surrounding himself with old school executives and board members, corporate individuals who didn't respect him and weren't able to evolve with the company, let alone shape the future. And years later, I think John Sculley himself put this into context.
What I didn't appreciate at the time, I think I do now, is how emotional, how deeply set the values are of a founder who was on pursuit of a noble cause and absolutely believes, passionately believes, that they're going to change the world. And here is this professional executive coming in and thinking about, well, how are the shareholders going to react? How are the analysts going to react? What do we do as a public corporation? And I did not have the breadth of experience at that time to really appreciate just how different leadership is when you are shaping an industry, as Bill Gates did or Steve Jobs did, versus when you are a competitor in an industry, in a public company, where you don't make mistakes, because if you lose, you're out.
It's important to understand that by cutting ties with Steve Jobs, Apple was also moving away from the design-centric, beautiful, and meaningful product ethos that differentiated the company from its competitors. Despite Jobs' lack of business experience and hit-or-miss product pipeline, under Steve's leadership, Apple managed to build a distinct brand and a fan base. Scully was so eager to make people forget about Steve that he immediately promoted Jean-Louis Gasset as the new company's CTO. The guy was at the time basically a Steve Jobs cosplayer. Both Scully and Gasset saw IBM as the new golden standard, with the CEO repeatedly stating that Apple would stop making toys.
Apple Computer will be a market-driven company. This doesn't infer in any way that we'll compromise in building great innovative products, because innovation will still be a driving force for our company. But being market-driven means we will adopt innovation to the needs of the market.
In another excerpt from the book, Esslinger explains that Rich Jordan, Apple's design manager, collected design statements from all over the world to build a pool of ideas for Apple's design team to draw from. The resulting hodgepodge was little more than a sampling of what was cool at design schools at the time. Instead of building the company's identity, management did everything they could to demolish Jobs' legacy, even starting a legal warfare against him.
I believe if we restore people's confidence in Apple as a company, and if we all stop talking about what we think is coming next and start focusing on the value of what we can offer people right now, which is a lot, then we can get things moving again.
And just like that, Apple went from leader to follow her.
It's failing. That's a fact.
It's overpriced.
There's no evidence that it's...
I'm the evidence. I'm the world's leading expert in the Mac, John. What's your resume?
You're issuing contradictory instructions, you're insubordinate, you make people miserable, our top engineers are fleeing to Sun, Dell, HP, Wall Street doesn't know who's driving the bus, we've lost hundreds of millions in value, and I'm the CEO of Apple, Steve. That's my resume.
But before that, you sold carbonated sugar water, right? I sat in a fucking garage with Wozniak and invented the future because artists lead and hacks ask for a show of hands.
All right, well, this guy's out of control. I'm perfectly willing to hand in my resignation tonight, but if you want me to stay, you can't have Steve. Settle him out. He can keep a share of stock so he gets our newsletter. He'll have to sever his connection to Apple. I'm dead serious. I want the secretary to call for a vote.
I fucking dare you.
We are Draper, so get your eyes.
Steve was down for sure, but reports of depression were not true at all. When he was fired in 1985, he was still very much in demand. He had rejected multiple offers to be a professor and was even nominated Entrepreneur of the Decade by Inc. magazine in 1989. In fact, it was during a conference at Stanford University in 2005 where he said that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could ever happen to him. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. And according to Jobs himself, it freed him to enter one of the most creative periods of his life. The thing though that I'd like to point out is that during an interview with Newsweek in September of 1985, Jobs said that he had given up on creating the next Apple. But as we like to say here at Draper, that was a complete lie, because Jobs was most definitely out for revenge. When he left Apple, it was only a matter of days before he launched his follow-up project, which he suspiciously branded as Next, almost a direct show of intention. He hired almost 50 midweight to senior Apple employees, some of which were even key management players. The truth is, he never really stopped thinking about Apple. All he wanted to do was to create the next Apple, the next big thing. When Jobs started Next, he didn't really know what to do with it. He knew that the education market would be the future, but still had no specific product nor service in mind. He was just focused on finding the best idea for that market, and that was it.
Apple was blinded by ego, and with everyone talking about my product and my idea, Scully's time was up. In the early 90s, his horizontal strategy began to fall apart, and production costs were no longer sustainable. With almost zero profit in 1993 and no clear market positioning, Scully's final hooray came in the form of the Newton, a device so bad that it was mocked not for what it was lacking, but for the features it had.
Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus.
On June 18, 1993, John Sculley resigned as Apple's CEO. Michael Spindler, former VP of Marketing and Apple COO, came in as replacement. Spindler was a troubled man with a fragile situation at home that often incapacitated him and clouded the strategically brilliant mind that got him there in the first place. He understood that the company would only be able to compete in selected core markets, but instead of reorganizing the product pipeline, Spindler decided to expand it. He opted to create a separate product department after each market segment, further weakening Apple innovation capabilities. He also cut costs by reducing the workforce, laying off more than 2,500 employees. At the same time, Spindler showed no interest in dealing with the media, and Apple's computer quickly fell into a pit of irrelevance. Employees' morale was at an all-time low, and revenues began falling. In stark contrast, this is what Apple's product pipeline looked like in 1996 after the launch of the Pippin console. But how did Apple end up in this place? I mean, this is Apple we're talking about. Along with Spindler, another player entered the fray. In 1994, the Italian manager Marco Landi got appointed as president of Apple Europe. Landi was an excellent strategist, and under his vision and leadership, the European division was able to turn $300 million in debt into $100 million in profit in less than 12 months. Landi would later earn a spot as Apple COO under Jill Amelio, becoming the perfect narrator for the madness that was going on in Cupertino. And you can bet your ass your boys found a way to talk to the guy. During a phone call in October 2021, he provided us with eye-opening insights and considerations into Apple's Middle Ages.
They get rid of Steve. Here comes Scully, and he starts making the Newton. So everything that concerned the Macintosh was not part of the future anymore. Scully wanted people to forget about Steve. He said, now I'm going to make something great. And in many ways, the Newton was innovative, but unfortunately it was far too advanced in terms of technology. It used the ARM processor, so it required a different OS from that of the Macintosh, and it failed completely. So they called Michael Spindler. When he came, instead of getting rid of the Newton and focusing on the Macintosh, he created the Pippin. He too was part of that same perverse logic of wanting to replace Steve through a product. It's almost inconceivable how a smart person could get there and say, now I'm going to create the Pippin. So he made a new product and a new OS. So you see what the situation looks like through the years? Apple was being derailed by a complete lack of focus and identity, because the Pippin was one thing, Newton was another, and the Macintosh was yet another. Plus, our OS was completely closed. We were the only ones using it. It was unimaginable that we could win a battle against a giant like Wintel. They kept making profits and eating away at our core market.
Jobs was on a mission. He was so determined to create something remarkable that he pulled out all the stops. He decided to create a revolutionary, user-friendly workstation aimed at higher education. He hired Frog Design and his old pal, Harmut Esslinger, to design the products, and even called on Paul fucking Rand to create the next corporate image. In pure Apple style, he also organized events and presentations to announce the next Cube. It was clear that Steve was never able to forget Apple. Just like the high school crush you never really get over. But unfortunately for Jobs, Next Cube came out retailing at 10 grand, and sales went poorly. Steve was once again left looking for money.
Boy, I've forgotten how much work it actually is to start a company. It's a lot of work. And you've got to do everything. You've got to come up with a name. You've got to come up with a logo. In addition to designing the product, you've got to figure out what to design. You've got to figure out how you're going to get it to the marketplace. You've got to do a part number system. You've got to go get bank accounts. You've got to set up charts, general ledgers, get a management information system, get a little kitchen set up, get a coffee maker, all this stuff.
Apple had lost its focus. After the PowerPC fiasco, Spindler invested in yet another OS, codenamed Copeland, and started looking for hardware partners to manufacture PCs. He then turned down all the offers and decided to sell the company. In 1994, IBM made a generous offer of $50 a share when Apple was only traded for $45. But Spindler thought it wasn't enough and decided to pass on the deal. Apple was basically at the mercy of its CEO's ego without even a functioning operating system.
It was actually mostly personal. See, all the CEOs that came after wanted people to forget about Steve Jobs. They wanted to impose their personality through a product, the same way Steve did with the Macintosh. They thought that they could identify themselves and the company's success through their own product. All the CEOs that came after Steve were not able to understand that what was most important at the time wasn't their personality, but Apple's success. And they spent their energy on everything that went against what Steve had created.
Jobs took notice and decided to plot for his return at the company he once founded. It's during those years that Jobs began to approach Gil Amelio, who was at the time simply a board member at Apple, inquiring for the CEO position. Jobs stated that there was only one person who could rally the troops. And Amelio thought it was inappropriate, but couldn't really tell whether Jobs was serious or not. After all, his charm and unique way he used to relate with others amused him. And Amelio didn't know at the time, but it was his inability to understand and read Jobs' true intentions that led to Steve's return.
Gil was a nice guy, but he had a saying. He said, Apple is like a ship with a hole in the bottom, leaking water. And my job is to get the ship pointed in the right direction.
Okay. At the 1996 January board meeting, Apple was on pace to lose $100 million by the end of business in March. And Michael Spindler presented the board of directors with an offer from Sun Microsystems for $25 a share. Apple was trading at $31 a share at the time, and the board strongly rejected the offer. More importantly, Spindler failed to tell the board that the company would end the year with $1 billion worth of unsold products. And on February 2nd, 1996, Gil Amelio succeeded Spindler as Apple CEO.
Our response to this is that we will get up, dust ourselves off, and move forward once again.
When did you change your mind and start building the Steve Jobs revenge machine?
House to have.
You remember Skylab? It was an unmanned satellite NASA sent up in the early 70s on a data gathering mission. The thing is, when they sent it up, they didn't know yet how they were going to get it back. But they felt like they were close enough that in the 8 years it was going to be up there, they'd figure it out.
They're on their way now. Yep.
They didn't. So after 8 years, it came crashing down a 1,000-mile swath across the Indian Ocean. A little to the left, a little to the right, somebody could have gotten hurt. I really wanted to build a computer for colleges. The technology just didn't catch up as fast as I needed to. You know we're out of money.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will be starting momentarily.
But then Apple stopped innovating, and I saw something better. When I know schools aren't going to buy a $13,000 dictionary with good speakers, you know I know that. But Apple will, because Avi Devanian is going to build them exactly the OS they need. They're going to have to buy me too, for $500 million in stock and end-to-end control on every product.
The scene is incredible, but also slightly inaccurate, because in 1988, Jobs still hadn't given up on the idea of surpassing Apple with Next. Back then, Steve saw the cracks in the wall of Apple computers, claiming that the Mac's pretty much going to be everything it's ever going to be sometimes next year, which turned out to be true, but he was more focused on revenge rather than return. His master plan came much later, when he realized that Next wasn't going anywhere. Both the Next Cube and Next Station were overpriced flops, and the company was only kept alive by Jobs' ability to find new investors. On the other end, though, Apple was in desperate need of a functioning and proprietary operating system. And only at that point did you get the phone calls to Emilio and Steve's decision to shut down production and focus on next step, which was Next OS. But truth be told, had Steve really wanted, he could have gotten back to Apple in a faster and simpler way. In the summer of 1995, his friend Larry Ellison, CEO and founder of Oracle, proposed to buy Apple and make Steve CEO of the company. But Jobs wanted the board and everybody else involved to truly understand his value, to understand how much Apple really needed Steve Jobs.
My idea was simple. Buy Apple and immediately make Steve CEO. Steve proposed a somewhat more circuitous approach. First, persuade Apple to buy Next Computer. Then Steve would join the Apple board, and over time, the board would recognize that Steve was the right guy to lead the company. I said, okay, that might work. But Steve, if we don't buy Apple, how are we going to make any money? Steve just shook his head and said, I'm not doing this for the money. I don't want to get paid. If I do this, I need to do this standing on the moral high ground. The moral high ground, I said? Well, that just might be the most expensive real estate on earth. But I knew I had lost the argument. Steve had made up his mind, right there and then, at Castle Rock in the summer of 1995, to save Apple his way.
Gil Amelio was known as a turnaround artist in the industry, and the board hoped that he could do it one more time at Apple. But despite the internal pleas to terminate failed projects like the Newton or the Pippin, Amelio wasted money and time on new ideas for an operating system. Apple clearly lacked the talent to develop an OS internally, and Microsoft kept devouring market shares. So in the summer of 1996, the board finally opted to look for outside alternatives. The final choice came down to 3 OSs. Solaris from Sun Microsystem, BOS, helmed by Jean-Louis Gasset, and one Next OS. CTO Alan Hancock pressed Amelio and Landi to go with Solaris. It was the most reliable of the 3, but Landi was strongly against it.
She came from IBM, so BOS to her was a small startup, while Next OS had been a complete failure. Steve was closing down marketing, sales, and production. But Sun Microsystem was a good company at the time. Their OS was solid, already quite stable, and so in the eyes of a professional, it was the right choice, since that's what you're looking for coming from IBM. To her, the risk of going with a small startup wasn't worth it, and I understand that. But what she didn't understand was that if we had gone with Sun Microsystem, we would have been prisoners of something that wasn't Apple. In that sense, Solaris might have very well been the right choice from a technical standpoint, but it wasn't strategic. Apple would have been in a subordinate position with a company that wasn't at its level.
Apple needed a proprietary operating system to become relevant again, and that left Amelio with only 2 options, BOS and Next. BOS was very respected in the industry and the first choice of the board, leading to Amelio engaging into conversations with Gasset. BOS was reportedly worth around $50 million at the time, and the board gave the green light to a very generous offer of $200 million. Amelio thought that he had secured the deal, but Gasset came back with a $300 million request. Negotiations then hit a roadblock, and Steve got news of it.
Steve for sure got in the way of the BOS acquisition, both in public by showing up at Apple when Gasset was scheduled to present his operating system, and in private by repeatedly inviting Amelio to his house. And that's the difference between 1985 Steve and 1996 Steve. He had learned the art of negotiation. After all, that's basically all he did for 11 years while looking for investors to keep Next alive. He had no product, no market, and still managed to make Next worth $500 million. And then you have his success at Pixar, which heavily relied on his ability to sign a publishing contract with Disney for a movie that was light years away from completion. And I think it's fascinating to look at the reasoning behind Jobs' plan, because he had failed at Apple and Next, yes, but his success of Toy Story earned him momentum and a lot of money because he took the company public right after the release of the movie, netting $1 billion in the IPO. And yet he still wanted to go back to his high school crush.
This shit is good.
On Christmas Eve 1996, Apple finalized the deal, acquiring Next and bringing Steve Jobs back to the fold. The deal was reportedly worth around $430 million, plus 1.5 million shares in Apple stock directed to Steve Jobs himself. And that begs the question, why did the board refuse to give $300 million to BOS, which was the first choice, but then conceded $430 million to Jobs? Once again, Marco Landi helped us piece together the elements, giving us a glimpse into Emilio's logic.
That's because Gil Amelio had the whole board in his hands. That's where he came from before becoming CEO. His only strategy was to show up at the Moscone Center in '97 with the big news. I brought Steve back, so he forced the situation. But for everyone else, that was inconceivable. He wasn't willing to spend $300 for his first choice, but he gave $400 for his third. What's the reason behind that? The only conceivable reason was that had he announced the acquisition of BOS, no one would have been excited. But he told people Steve was coming back, so Apple fans rose again and looked at the company more motivated than ever. And the board had to accept his conditions. That was an imposition by Gil Amelio, who only discussed it with the board, which is technically the right thing to do, because they're the one deciding. But he didn't consult with anyone else before the deal was finalized.
In spite of the money spent, this was Emilio's chance to make Apple relevant again. The stage was set for Macworld Expo in 1997 at the Moscone Center. Emilio was ready for another turnaround and began writing the book, How I Saved Apple. But what was supposed to be a grandiose announcement turned out to be the last straw in Emilio's downfall. See, his speech at Macworld was kind of lackluster.
It was a total shit show.
Unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable.
On top of presenting one of the worst financial quarters in Apple's history, he didn't memorize the speech, he often went overtime and even forgot to introduce guests.
Just go and watch it. It's on YouTube and it features some of the cringiest moments in business history.
All the newspapers talked about that performance. I'm not the one saying it. If you read the newspapers of the time, you'll see how he lost all his credibility that night. That was the moment when Steve realized that he had no match.
So, we want to get some of this technology to developers' hands as quickly as we can, and Steve pointed that out. I would say that this, by the way, the final release in the middle of '98, we're calling a unified release, and as I mentioned, the other one over there is the premiere release.
Jobs came back with the advisor moniker, but as soon as the paper was signed, it was game over for Emilio. Steve started playing mind games with management. He was often seen at Apple's HQ talking with many employees, but he rarely attended board meetings. And when he did, he took the spotlight and admonished members before they even started talking. At the same time, he let the media know that it didn't have much faith in the company. Even employees were confused by his behavior. Some managers came out and said that Jobs was a fair-weather friend of Apple. Depending on where the money is where opinion is.
I very much want to see Apple get turned around, and I think it's gonna. So I don't know how much more committed I could be if people need these symbols. Well, maybe that'll happen, I don't know. But you know, my answer to them is I don't know how I could be working any harder. And
during spring in 1997, a mysterious shareholder sold 1.5 million shares of Apple stock, sending the stock crashing. That shareholder was, of course, one Mr. Steve Jobs, who had sold all the shares that he received in the next deal. Emilio was fired right away, and other members of the board soon resigned. The book How I Saved Apple had changed the title, becoming On the Firing Line, My 500 Days at Apple.
Jobs was testing the waters, trying to understand the power balance between managers and divisions, while also scouting for the talent on which to build the future of the company. And I don't really know what Emilio thought was going to happen, and I also think it's impossible to make it make sense in retrospect, but he had already lost when he decided to buy Next.
As far as I know about Gil Amelio's character, I'm sure he certainly wouldn't have dreamt that Steve would have done what he did. Otherwise, he wouldn't have pushed it to have him back. He thought he could control Steve, and that was his big mistake. He thought that since Apple's situation was so catastrophic, and since at the start of every year he had to give this huge presentation at the Moscone Center about the current situation and his plans for the future, in such a critical situation, with all that money being lost without a clear strategy, he thought, I'll use this big announcement, Steve coming back to Apple, to distract from everything else and have people talk about that rather than the financials. When Jobs came back and we bought his OS, he came back as the CEO's advisor. So Gil thought he could control him, that he could use him. I think he totally lacked foresight there. The ability to comprehend that Steve wasn't coming back as Gil Amelio's advisor. Steve had a clear strategy for what he should have done to take back control. So they both tried to control one another. But the talent, the quality, the vision that Steve brought to the table won against Gil's total lack of vision and ability to implement a clear strategy.
In less than 6 months, Steve Jobs changed the entire board of directors, gave the boot to Emilio, and assumed the role of interim CEO. There was still much work to do, but with its visionary founder back at the helm, Apple began to turn the tides in its favor. Design and innovation once again became the foundation of the company, and Macworld 997 represented the starting block for Apple to run at the top of the food chain again. Today, in 2022, we know Apple to be the most valuable company in the world, but there was a moment there between 97 and 96 where things could have gone very differently for both the company and the world as we know it. What would have happened if Gasset had accepted the offer? Or if Emilio had played its cards right?
Winners get to write history, you know? And sometimes somebody's role is to be the loser so that others can thrive. And Emilio filled that role while Steve Jobs went on to shape the fabrics of the world.
Of the world. Steve really did change the world. See? This is what I mean when I talk about fate. He was number 2 on that list. If DC had accepted our offer, our world would have been completely different. There would be no iPod, no iPad, no iPhone. This is what has always struck me. It always made me wonder about fate. Because there's not a lot of things in our society that had a similar impact like the iPhone. Even if you disregard that, Steve would have had a great impact on so many more things. But he's not here anymore.
Now think of that before going to bed.
We are Draper, so get your eyes on us.